The first time I met a mulberry, it was a confusing introduction. At the time, I considered my general plant knowledge to be better than average, but somehow this tree just didn't make sense. It was beautifully shaped, an open-grown tree with these scalloped, alternate leaves that I couldn't identify offhand. I knew sassafras had 3 leaf shapes, but this tree clearly wasn't sassafras. And weirdest of all, it was positively dripping with a bounty of berries that, for all the world, looked like blackberries. But a full-on blackberry tree? That couldn't be right. The flocks of robins and woodpeckers flitting through the branches, however, knew what I did not know at that time. They understood that the abundance offered by these common trees is something to eat, not just gawk at. When I sampled my first mulberry that day, I was shocked by the sweet honey vanilla berry flavor. Now with berries on the brain, I started seeing mulberry trees everywhere that summer, along city sidewalks, country lanes, and park avenues, and below them, the ground was carpeted with free fruit. How did I make it all the way to my 20s and never taste a mulberry? No idea. But I've done my best to make up for it in all the years that followed that summer afternoon. These sweet, warm weather treats have become one of my favorite wild fruits. And if you've also made it this far in your life without gathering an ample handful of finger-staining goodness, I hope to help you rectify that error. There are 4 species of mulberry in the United States. Some native, some introduced, all edible. As you'll soon discover, mulberry leaves, while distinctive to the genus, are anything but consistent. They're scalloped, sometimes lobed, sometimes entire. They do have a family resemblance, however, and so the best advice I can give you is to get out there and find as many mulberry trees as you can. The more you observe them in person, the more you'll recognize them in all their weird and wacky shapes. Now, Morus nigra is an introduced species found scattered across the lower portion of the country. It's relatively rare though. Morus microphylla, the Texas mulberry, is a native tree constrained to parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. I've never encountered either of these 2 tree species and won't be featuring them in this video, but everything I say about mulberries applies to them if you happen to come across them. The real food haul is to be found with Morus alba and Morus rubra, the 2 species that carpet the country from coast to coast. If you encounter a mulberry tree, it's very likely that it's one of these 2. American mulberry is Morus rubra, a native species often grown in the forest understory as a graceful, slender-limbed tree. The leaves have a fine, sandpapery grit feel, with a distinctive sinus-step tooth in the hollows of the leaf shape. If the leaf has lobes, that is, and it often has an elongated tip. Now, it is easy to confuse the unlobed leaves with a couple other tree species before the tree starts producing fruit. We'll discuss those differences soon. But in the meantime, it's good to know that it produces a dark purple fruit that's large and sweet. Now, the poorly named white mulberry is Morus alba. It's an Asian species that was brought over as food for the silkworm industry that never really took off in the United States. Instead, the tree naturalized to the point of becoming our most abundant mulberry species. Unlike American mulberry, it has smooth, shiny leaves that noticeably lack both that bitty tooth and the sinuses of the leaves and the elongated tip. The tree form is generally more dense and more robust, especially if it's grown in the open, which it often does. The fruit is a bit shorter than Morus rubra, and despite its name, usually ripens to the same blue-black. Now, occasionally, a specific tree will produce white or pinkish-white fruit, but most don't. Now, the taxonomist who named these Asian trees had only ever observed white-fruited trees at the time, christening them with a name that makes no sense in the long run. That confusion often leads folks to misidentify black-fruited white mulberry as M. rubra and identify the few white-fruiting white mulberry trees as Morus alba, completely deleting the true American mulberry from field guides and foraging books. Now, this confusion is so prevalent that when I ordered American mulberry seedlings from my local Department of Conservation, they actually sent us the non-native Asian trees mislabeled as Morus rubra. Now, I wasn't aware of the mistaken identity until this year, when I noticed that a few of our 30+ trees had white fruit. I took a closer look at those shiny leaves, and the truth was revealed. Now, for the forager, this mix-up doesn't mean much. Both trees are similarly edible. Berries is berries, and in this case, they're tasty from any tree. But for those who make a business in conservation, correct identification, or trying to reestablish native plant populations, it's kind of a big deal. The mistakes I've seen in books, field guides, parks, and even in my own orders for native plantings are so prevalent, it's embarrassing. Furthermore, it's scrubbing an entire species of native tree from our collective understanding. Now let's talk about some mulberry lookalikes. There's really nothing that looks like a mulberry fruit, except a mulberry fruit. If you see a blackberry-like fruit on a tree in early summer, it's guaranteed that you found the right tree. Isn't it nice when things are that straightforward? Now, if the tree isn't fruiting, it might be easy to confuse non-lobed mulberry trees with American basswood, Tilla americana, or slippery elm, Ulmus rubra. Now, if it's fruit that you're after, there's no danger in this potential mix-up. Those two trees won't produce mulberries, obviously. Now, if it's the edible leaves you're after, and we'll talk more on that soon, there's still little danger. Basswood leaves are similarly edible and delicious, and slippery elm leaves have a long history of being used for tea, so there's no toxic threat. There should be no guessing in foraging, however. Get acquainted with the distinctively asymmetrical base of a slippery elm leaf, and you'll be able to tell the difference between it and mulberry. Now let's talk about harvesting mulberries. The fruit. Mulberries fruit around the same time as wild strawberries near the end of May and through the first half of June. When these trees do produce, boy do they produce! You'll find trees with abundant wild fruit, branches nearly obscured by generosity. The ripest fruits will usually be a deep purple-black color, although the white fruited variants will be snowy white or pinky tinged when they're ripe. Give a berry a taste to see if it's good. You'll know once the sweetness hits you. Though I see no need to hurry through a berry picking session, you can usually speed up the process by setting down a tarp and giving the branches a good shake. Ripe berries will rain down, usually with a helping of stink bugs and ants. Thankfully though, mulberries float, making cleaning your wild haul a bit easier. Now let's talk about the leaves. A second product to be gathered from this tree are the edible shoots and leaves. Wait a minute, you might be thinking, leaves? Tree leaves for food? What am I, a giraffe? Well, you could play act as one and strip a leaf or two off a standing tree, but I don't know what kind of friends it's gonna get you. But yes, mulberry trees have quite edible leaves. The young, green branch shoots of spring are tender for choice meals, but really any leaf can be used. They're tasty, they don't have any bitter flavor, and they're abundantly available for the tree's growing season. Both raw or cooked, you can use them as you would any other tender, enjoyable green. If you're eating them raw, however, try to pick the youngest, most tender, bright green spring leaves you can. Leaves that are fully matured might leave you chewing for longer than you want. Now, beyond salads or stir fries, leaves can be also dried and used for tea. They've also been dried, ground, and added to flour as a nutritional amendment. Now let's talk about cooking and using mulberries. For fresh eating, there's honestly little that can improve a good fresh mulberry. Gather them by the handful or try them individually. You might be pleasantly surprised to find the range of flavors found from tree to tree. In my own little mulberry glade, for example, I have some trees that taste candy-like, while others have a more subtle sweetness. Just don't judge a mulberry by the first bite. The next berry might taste different. Now when cooked, they do sometimes leave a little bit to be desired. The first time I made a mulberry crumble, I mixed it with some wild strawberries that were also grown at the time, and it was absolutely decadent. Now the second time I made a mulberry crumble, I made it with pure mulberry, and it was unremarkably bland. As I soon learned, the sweetness of the berries can be unbalanced when heated. I think it's just because they lack any noticeable acidity. Now if you combine mulberries with a nice tart apple, a dash of lemon juice, or some fresh wild strawberries, it'll make a world of improved difference. In his book, Incredible Wild Edibles, which also contains an excellent chapter on foraging for mulberries, Samuel Thayer recommends mixing ripe and unripe fruit when making jams and preserves as a way to balance the flavors. Now, if you can't decide how to use your mulberry glut all at once, it's super easy to freeze them until you're ready to use them. Now, mulberries can be juiced, cooked into syrup, fermented, or cooked into finger-stained chutneys, and pretty much used any way you would use any other berry. Some folks make a big deal about those little stems. They do stay stubbornly attached. Honestly, I see it as a non-issue, and I don't notice them, and I eat them. The fact that mulberries lack those hard, crunchy seeds of other fruits like blackberries more than makes up for any little stemminess. If they do bug you though, you can cook down the fruit and send it through a food mill. That should clean it up nicely enough for your purposes. So have you met a mulberry? If you haven't, or if you've only noticed them when they stain the sidewalk a bright purple in June, then I hope you fix that situation as soon as possible. They're a great tree to add to your permaculture landscape, a wonderful friend to visit for a pick-me-up on the trail, and a multi-purpose food source that anyone interested in self-sufficiency would do well to get acquainted with.